Stephen Hayes served 17 years as President and CEO of Corporate Council on Africa, and he also served as U.S. Africa policymaker. He built the Corporate Council on Africa into the nation's most influential business organization on Africa. He also frequently advised the U.S. government on trade and economic policy with Africa. During his tenure, he received various awards for his leadership on U.S.-Africa economic and trade issues from Senegal, Kenya, and South Africa. He is my guest today on Future Africa Spotlight. Mr. Stephen Hayes, thank you for talking to Future Africa today.
Thank you. My pleasure. It's good to see you.
Obviously, these days, different international media organizations are broadcasting a false narrative about an ongoing Ethiopian situation. Do you know the reality, and do you really know what the West plot out of the ongoing situation in Ethiopia?
You know, I was recently talking to an editor in the UK who said that anybody who claims they know what's going on in Africa is probably not telling the truth, and I think it's true. It's a complex picture. I've been to Ethiopia many times, but in fact, do I actually know what's going on? I don't think anyone really knows exactly what's going on, to be truthful. We get different reports. There's conflicting reports daily, and so it's a tough one to say. Yes, I do think that Ethiopia as a nation, and in fact the government, needs a little fairer treatment. Frankly, it seems to be a little one-sided, and it lacks a historic narrative.
What does it mean by one-sided?
Well, I think that initially, and I do see a shift just recently, but I think initially there was a lot of sympathy with the Tigrayans, or Tigray, I should say, in general, without understanding the historical nature of why this has evolved. And I think that there's been a very good PR campaign to promote the Tigray point of view, and I understand that. Ethiopia hasn't proven to be quite as skillful, I think, in some ways, but it's as we say, a good friend of mine would say, it's a big mess, and it needs to be resolved.
Okay, the Ethiopian federal government has started the law enforcement measure before 9 months, and still being undergoing, right? And from this clash, from this law enforcement measure, as I have said now, media and giant nations like US and European Union are deaf to understand the reality and blind to see what's going on here. It seems kind of favoring only TPLF, and TPLF is declared as a terrorist group by Ethiopian federal government and by Ethiopian parliament. Why US and European Union failed to understand this reality, and why the US particularly failed to leak the bitter reality?
It's a good question. I find myself puzzled on US policy right at the moment, but I think that a lot of factors play into that. I think a historic tie that some in the Biden administration who played prominent roles in the Obama administration had strong ties to Prime Minister Meles, and I think those still have, and his people, and I think those have played somewhat of a role in the people who were involved in those decisions. But there is a new cast in the Biden administration. I think they're needing to get their feet on the ground on this. I think also the U.S. ambassador, whom I have a high regard for, frankly, is probably going to play a more active role. But right now, I think that the problem has been Afghanistan, our focus on other issues. Ethiopia is not seen as a major issue right now to the Biden administration, given everything else that they're dealing with. So I don't think there's been enough attention to this. I also, I just don't understand some of the policy, frankly. Ethiopia has been a strong ally of the United States for the past several years. I think that what Prime Minister Abiy has done for the country in terms of opening it up a lot more has been very good. I think it's been good for younger people. I also think it's been proven to be a more inclusive government than past governments, where the one region dominated the government so strongly. So I think it's to me it's still a puzzle. Certainly, there are atrocities in Tigray, and I suspect it's by both sides. That's the nature of war. Unfortunately, it doesn't resolve, it doesn't absolve it, but it's an issue. And I think we've got to be more realistic. What I would like to see is the U.S. engage with the Ethiopian government. It's my understanding there hasn't been a strong engagement on this, and I think it's important that begin to happen.
Okay, in your opinion, the U.S. involvement somehow in Ethiopian sovereign affairs and the U.S. policy that is designated to Ethiopia and Africa is somehow puzzling as of your understanding, right? What does it mean?
Yes.
By puzzling?
Well, I don't see a policy per se, and it's Ethiopia it plays a very important role in the Horn of Africa right now, and to be seen as supporting one side over a government that I think has been fairly progressive, given all things, is I think brings questions as to why it is so. And I don't think anyone really has been able to explain that, except I think that Tigray has had a very good PR effort that the Ethiopian government hasn't had. And of course, I think part of the problem is that most of the bloodshed is in the Tigray area, not entirely, and so media attention goes to that area rather than focus on the broader area of resolution of the problem. I think the U.S. I'm not of the government, but I do have a long history in the area and an engagement in Africa that most people don't. But I think that the U.S. needs to be more engaged in dialogue with the Ethiopian government to help resolve this. I am sure in saying that there is, the U.S. ambassador has no doubt reached out, but it may be that, you need to see higher officials speak in a more balanced way and to, put this on a higher plane. And again, though, in fairness, given all the issues that the U.S. is dealing with right now, internally and externally, it's difficult to put it on the higher plane, at least publicly.
Okay, the U.S. count Ethiopia as one of geostrategically important nation in the world, right? What is the importance?
Certainly in Africa.
Yeah, certainly in Africa, and particularly in the Horn, Ethiopia is very important and plays a pivotal role in strengthening the interest of U.S. in the Horn and East Africa. Can you tell us the interest of U.S. in the Horn region?
Certainly, it's again, it's clear that Ethiopia plays an important role. In fact, it's probably the most vital role, just based on size, population, history, everything else. No doubt about it. The issues I think that for the U.S., it's not only U.S. interest. I think there's also the somewhat altruistic part of wanting to have a more peaceful region in general. but certainly U.S. interests aren't helped by the current situation. Their interest should be in international trade. Ethiopia is I think key to the future of East Africa, not just the Horn of Africa. I think Ethiopia may, if it were able to work together, and it's a tough environment when you have 80 or more cultures and languages in the country to work together. But Ethiopia could be the dominant economy in the next 50 years in that region. It's not going to happen if they're at war with itself. The other area, of course, is the Middle East. Ethiopia provides an important ally, has in terms of our Middle East interest. And certainly regarding Somalia, Ethiopia has provided a very supportive role to the United States as well. Now, all that seems to be at risk. And for that reason, I don't quite understand why a more balanced public posture isn't taken. I think there's been I think there's been an effective campaign in terms of the destruction of Tigray area and so forth, but it's very clear, I think, to some that the so-called atrocities aren't limited to one side. It is a war. It does happen. It doesn't excuse it in any way, but there needs to be a more realistic picture. Now, this past week, the U.S. has been more critical of Tigray in this, and I've been encouraged by that. It's starting to show the early signs of balance on the issue, and so I think, to me, the next couple of weeks could be critical in terms of what role the U.S. plays. It's also, the other issue, and I'm trying to understand why the U.S. is taking such a strong role on one side, other than the historic friendships that existed between former Tigray leaders who were leaders of Ethiopia in a past administration, is why given the Chinese advance into Ethiopia, which is pretty significant, as you know better than I, why, in fact, we seem to not be able to compete with that.
You're a senior personality in African politics. You served in different African nations, and you know African politics very well, right? And let's go to Ethiopian politics particularly. How do you see about the legitimacy of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed? Because a TPLF entity, the terrorist element, these days is still accusing the Premier Abiy Ahmed. What do you know about his legitimacy and the cause of the clash and the ongoing casualties and their accusation on the humanitarian crisis? Also, can you put together and forward it to the audience?
Well, in fairness, I probably can't. Simply, I haven't had a conversation with the Prime Minister. I do have a high regard for him. I do think he deserves the Nobel Prize for resolving a 30-year issue between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And I think he does want a more progressive nation. That's been fairly clear. I think, you may want to look at the decisions that led to the war with Tigray. I am not sure of all that, so I don't want to come out and misstate. But on the other hand, the Tigray leaders are those who once had leadership in the Ethiopian government. They were removed, as I understand it, some of them, and they resented that move. And so then, obviously, they wanted back in, and that's become a real trouble spot. Leadership plays an important role in what the people do. There are very seldom just uprisings by the people by themselves that are not instigated in anywhere in the world, and also aren't successful without some leadership, good or bad motives. So I think that what's needed now between Tigray and Ethiopia is I should say Tigray as part of Ethiopia as well, is there needs to be some constructive dialogue. Is that possible right now? I don't know. The both sides have, I guess, heightened the anger. It's made it much more difficult to have a dialogue, but a dialogue is absolutely essential. It's not going to be resolved. Perhaps one side or other can be crushed. I don't think so, because you have interests outside of Ethiopia who are also interested in this continuing. So you need the dialogue. You need somebody that both sides can respect. That's very hard to do right now. The Chinese aren't going to be accepted by Tigray. The Russians have their own motives. They're not going to be accepted by either ones as mediators. The EU perhaps. Still, it seems to me there's still a very positive role that the U.S. can play, because, again, the historic U.S.-Ethiopia relationship, the Ethiopian diaspora, particularly in the U.S., is very important. And so I think all of that almost, I don't know, begs, it almost requires a U.S. mediator, perhaps. Whether the U.S. wants to get in that role again is another issue. And whether it can do it is also a question, given all other issues going on and all other problems going on with the United States. But to me, the U.S. needs to play a stronger and more positive role in the Horn of Africa, or in fact, from a U.S. perspective, not an Ethiopian perspective, but from a U.S. perspective, we lose our interest in there that have been built over the years. And we lose a lot of trust and respect. So I think the U.S. needs to become more engaged in a positive manner.
You noted your recommendation for both parties to sit down and negotiate on their matters, right? But the very irony is this terrorist element savagely attacked a military base. It is equivalent with bargaining and attacking a certain sovereign nation. And the military is obviously a safeguarder of a nation, right? How dare this people, the mass majority, would negotiate with those terrorist elements, because they did a very uncompromised act. How do you see this?
Well, yes, I would agree that was the initiating physical factor in starting this war. I haven't seen any literature that questions that. The reasons for it is up for debate. I tend to think it's people who were in power who still want to get back in power in the overall government, but nevertheless, that's where things are. It is easy to understand to say, hey, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. Okay, that's a common stance. On the other hand, how are you going to resolve this if somebody isn't talking to one another? Are you really going to be able to crush Tigray? Historically, most of the weapons in Ethiopia were stored in Tigray. So how are you? That's a big issue. And again, I'd say who's supplying those, who's reinforcing those weapons, where it's coming from. I do not think for a second that it's coming from the United States, which to me, does say that there's still a role for the United States, because it's not. It may be publicly favoring what, or seemed to favor Tigray, but in reality, it hasn't fueled the conflict. You could argue that its lack of stance so far has encouraged Tigray, but I think that may be changing soon as well. So I think that in the present circumstances, I don't see the government and Tigray sitting down together. You're going to need somebody in the middle that almost forces the issue and ends what is, like most wars, is a ridiculous war, frankly, but nevertheless, and of course, the fighting parties would not call it ridiculous, and I understand that. But given the place in which humanity is in now, with climate change, a growing gap of rich and poor, everything else, there are far more important issues that have to be addressed, and they can't be addressed when we're at war with each other. So I think there is a role. The U.S. needs to start a dialogue with Ethiopia, first of all. There doesn't seem to be a strong one, although, again, I want to emphasize, I think the ambassador is probably doing what she can best she can do under difficult circumstances. But there needs to be a higher profile on the U.S. side, in my view, that brings balance to the issue. That's my view.
You served in Africa for a long period of time and for so many years, right? And you know TPLF very closely. And can you put your comparison between TPLF and the incumbent administration?
First, I did meet with Prime Minister Meles on many occasions, and I think if he were alive today, there might be a more reasonable dialogue, at least from the Tigray side in any case. But nevertheless, yeah, certainly Prime Minister Abiy has brought about a more openness to government. People have participated more openly in it. I think that's a very positive thing. He's opened the economy. I cannot fault him for using China, because to help open the economy, China has done some very good things for the economy. We can argue why, you can argue geopolitical circumstances, but overall, I think in Ethiopia, especially, China has had a more positive rather than negative role. Now, are they becoming dominant? That's another issue, but that's not my issue today. In any case, I think Prime Minister Abiy has done a lot of the right things. I think you can argue, has he reacted properly in Tigray? Has he done everything? I don't know. You probably don't either. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know who's talking to whom, but his pride has been hurt. His leadership has been challenged. And his leadership has been challenged by a group that held power for a long time in Ethiopia. And I think that they aren't willing to give up power, or they aren't willing to talk and help in this dialogue. This war, not dialogue. There's no dialogue. So I think the people in Tigray, the leadership in Tigray, need to also take a deep look at themselves and say, look, is this really what we want for Ethiopia? And I don't think people are necessarily thinking about what they want for Ethiopia or Tigray. They're thinking about their own power needs and what the pleasures that they had when they were in power. It's a difficult thing to step away from. So I think that's a big issue. So how do you resolve this? Is it going to be resolved by the continuing bloodshed? Probably not. I don't see either side being strong enough to take over the Ethiopian government. So I think there's a dialogue. Is Tigray an important part of Ethiopia? So certainly it is, and particularly where it's located makes it important as well. So how do you resolve that? There's got to be some resolution to that, and I don't have the answer to that. And it's not. I don't know if anyone quite has yet. I think there needs to be a dialogue, and that dialogue doesn't exist. And I don't think it's going to exist unless you get a third party that is reasonably trusted. But I think any third party that's not part of the overall culture is also going to miss some signals because their intervention is going to be based on their own values as opposed to necessarily the values of that exist in Ethiopia. So it's complex, but you've got to have, I think, interventions. When I say intervention, I mean negotiation, not yet another army. And of course, that's never going to come from the U.S. after Afghanistan in any case. So it's you need some. Maybe it's more than a third party, but maybe you need a five party or something like that. I don't know, but there needs to be a dialogue. The U.S. can start that by at least being more open and talking directly with Prime Minister Abe rather than trying to isolate him. It doesn't make sense.
Okay, the U.S. Always, as it's, through its policy, most of the time appreciate and promote development, democracy, and halt humanitarian crisis and fight against terrorist groups in their policy majorly. But the Ethiopian parliament has declared TPLF as a terrorist group. US, any president who runs to the presidential post in the US always talk about how to fight and combat terrorists like Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, MS-13, you see? TPLF is rated and labeled as a terrorist group by Ethiopian government. Is that only US who declare a certain tag on a certain party? And why US failed to understand this status quo?
Well, that's to me, it's been a major theme for at least 40 years. I've been saying that the United States, not so much Ethiopia, but the Achilles heel in U.S. thinking, I think, has always been the lack of cultural understanding. We view the world in terms of our own previous success, and think that model is easily adapted if people would just follow that course. The world will be a happier place. The fact is that cultures think differently, they act differently, they have different values, and we don't readily understand that or adapt our own thinking to that. We expect people to adapt to our thinking because we've seen it. We've become a believer in our own propaganda in a way, and this is the best way to go. It may be, I don't know, but the fact is that there are many courses, many different ways to have positive results. It's not just through a U.S. system. And frankly, I wouldn't wish U.S. democracy on anyone the way it's practiced now, because it's too much out of control right now in terms of the expenses, everything else. But that's another side. The U.S. needs to understand cultures in a different way, in a better way. We've never factored cultural differences into our thinking on policies. Ethiopia has not simply one culture, but dozens of cultures that need to be better understood and appreciated. It's a very tough job governing Ethiopia, frankly. So I think in terms of initiating perhaps a dialogue, I think we also have to be prepared to listen a lot more effectively. I don't think we've been particularly good listeners at times, but that's another issue.
Okay, another question. Do you think the alignment that Ethiopia has with Russia and China, as well as Turkey and other Asian tigers, has pissed US off?
I don't know. We get pissed off by all kinds of things. So I don't. I think the competition with China is worrisome to this country for good reasons. By good reasons is that yes, they're highly competitive. We've lost our competitive edge, so yes, we're worried about that. I think anybody in that place would be worried about it. Does it make China an enemy? No, it shouldn't. I think there are areas where China and the U.S. could help resolve the issues, frankly, that you're facing in Ethiopia. Russia is a complex issue. We've got nobody knows. I should say nobody, but our attitudes towards Russia is just mixed right now. We don't have a coherent policy, in my view, towards Russia. We too easily go to sanctions. Sanctions hurts the poorest of the population more than they hurt the people that we're trying to change. The reality is that every other country in the world, be it Turkey, Russia, China, have every right to be doing the same thing as the U.S. The fact is, we've been the top dog for a long time, and the world's changing. The balance of power is changing, and we're having a hard time adapting to that. I hope we can adapt to it. I'd like to see the U.S. lead. I think some of the values of this country are important. They're respected, but we've got to do a lot of soul searching here too.
Let's talk about human aid and humanitarian crisis. And obviously, U.S. uses humanitarian assistance as a tool to infiltrate any sovereign nation's internal affairs. And most African countries these days are saying no to aid. But since it is existential, some leaders are forced to receive the grant. We know why U.S. grant aid for Africa. It's a means of manipulation. We know that. And humanitarian crisis, they talk. It's a fictitious kind of story. They talk about humanitarian crisis where their interest lies. You understand what I'm saying?
I understand very well.
We don't need their aid, and let them stay there. Can we say this? And can a nation in Africa could possibly say like this?
I think there is no country in the world that uses its aid policies in a totally altruistic manner. China, for instance, is building things. It's building areas. They're not doing it solely for their own benefit, for the benefit of the Ethiopian people. It's because they want to.
When it comes to, let me pause you here, Stephen. When it comes to China, always it's a kind of win-win.
Yeah, I agree. It is a win-win, and so it's accepting a China.
But when it comes to America, mine is mine and yours is negotiable. That is their story.
Well, I think that's a perception that some have. I think it's a grayer situation than that. I think when the Agency for International Development was started under President Kennedy, it was certainly to help promote U.S. values, no doubt about it. But it was also there initially as an aid agency to help countries in terms of disasters, everything else. It evolved into something far more. I basically prefer that countries not accept aid, not simply AID, but aid. I think that the problems that countries have are more resolved if they can do it themselves without outside help. We are an interdependent world. There are areas, there are those who are altruistic, who want to see Ethiopia do better, and hence, if you do this. But most aid and most assistance is tied. There's no doubt about it, and it doesn't matter what country. And it's I am in favor of reducing aid, frankly, and moving it back to a disaster relief area in terms of if there's a famine, yes, why not offer aid? In terms of famines, the country can't feed itself at that particular moment. The country also needs to address why that happened beyond just weather. But also, it's sometimes there's a very good reason to step forward and help others. It's just to me that's the nature of both the Ethiopian heritage, frankly, and many other areas. Aid in and of itself is not bad. How you use it, how you leverage it, can be.
Let me interrupt you. Some people argue that aid never helped the ever existing problem of a nation. Maybe it's for a time being, it might help for survival, right?
Right.
Very famous economist once said, unless aid is granted for investment or for saving, it is a cancer. You might know that Professor Dambisa Moyo of Zambia.
No, well, yeah.
You know her very well, right?
I happen to agree largely with her thesis.
Exactly.
I think again, aid
would humanitarian assistance lift Ethiopians from BRICS? You understand that way?
It could, in the terms of what humanitarian assistance does. It allows people to live longer. And so does that then allow them, give them the space and time to build something? Yes, it does. Without humanitarian assistance, they die in terms of famine. I mean, that's the extreme. So there is, to me, in my mind, there's a very good rationale for humanitarian assistance. The problem, I think, is that aid has become a political weapon for many, many countries. And and that's complicated rather than helped, I think, the solution to problems.
Stephen Hayes, due to the interest of time, I would like to wrap up my discussion with you here. And thank you very much for your insight. And I'm really grateful to your analysis on the behalf of this media house. Thank you very much once again.
Well, thank you. And I will say, I just think a lot of understanding needs to be developed all over, not simply in myself, but many others. It's a complex problem, and the only way you're going to resolve it's dialogue. Thank you.
Dear viewers, this brings you the end of our edition for today. See you next time with another edition. Bye-bye.